Hola, I am Professor Jorge Leal, historian at the University of California, Riverside, and this is the discursive power of rock en español and the desire for democracy. O el rock en español y el anhelo democrático para más corto.
Hello everyone, I am Citlali Sosa-Riddell and I am also a historian, professor at California University of San Marcos, and I welcome you to our podcast.
Now that we have done 5 episodes, we figured to record this one to reflect a bit on some of the questions that have come up during and after the recording of our first episodes that we have created. Among ourselves, those questions that we bounce back after listening to each other's episodes, and also folks like you that have been listening and sending us your questions. So let's get this conversation started. Professor Sosa-Riddell, you have created several episodes on el rock nacional argentino. And I wanted to ask you, what does rock en español mean to you personally and also academically?
You know what? Thank you, Jorge, because this is something that I think was always kind of strange for me because I'm not an immigrant. I come from a Mexican background, but my family has been here for a little over 100 years at this point. So for me, rock en español wouldn't seem like something that would really make sense for my own interest. But I do remember that in the 1990s, when I was in college, hearing about rock en español and the first time I heard it and how much that meant to me, because I think so much of the music, which was really at that point Mexican rock en español, like Café Tacuba, for example, what I was really struck by was how much it sounded like a lot of the regional Mexican music, which I grew up on. And so it felt like a kind of a mixture of the music that I liked from my family and from growing up to also kind of the music that I listened to that was more, I don't know, I mean, we'll call it rock in a general way, but I also was a big new wave fan growing up too. So it felt like an interesting mix of these parts of my person that had oftentimes felt like very separate. So I think that's what really was exciting for me. In terms of the academic side, I think, meeting you and hearing about your interest in studying rock en español, it didn't seem like something I could ever study. I also studied the 19th century, so it feels like something very contemporary and cool, way beyond what we traditionally study. So you have, of course, here Jorge, who studies very cool contemporary stuff as a historian. And I think it's really inspired me to think about ways to connect issues of trying to seek democracy in early Latin America, right? Because I study 1820s to the 1850s, and then thinking about those questions of democracy today, right? How are we constantly in a quest to try to make countries the best and try to find and create democracies? That's why I'm fascinated by rock en español.
Your work is about the 19th century borderlands, the borderlands between Mexico and the U.S., the exchange of ideas and political beliefs between Latin America and the U.S., but also there was a sense of nostalgia as what we now know as the American Southwest, Texas, New Mexico, obviously California, become part of the United States, and they are broken off from Mexico and by extension the Americas. So I want to ask you, since there's a thread in rock en español now, how it's been discussed, how it's been consumed about nostalgia, or just having merely a nostalgic aspect to it. How does nostalgia fit in your work? How do you see nostalgia working out in rock en español?
Yeah, I noticed that in the article that you wrote, and we'll talk about that in a little bit in order so you can talk about it a little bit more. But you do mention nostalgia, and I know you personally have always been bothered by the idea of nostalgia. And it struck me because when I looked at how in California we're fascinated by like this idea of like the Spanish past or the Mexican past, and we think about it as a nostalgia. One of the ways that historians have worked on thinking about that is to challenge, like let's look at what's real, not what our nostalgia tells us. And as I started to study this, I realized that I really love nostalgia as a concept, and it's not something that we should try to boot out of everybody's system. Because imagine if you had to get rid of a nostalgia for your family, for your loved ones who have moved on. and passed away, or for foods that we grew up on, or for memories that we have. To get rid of our nostalgia would take away so much of who we are. It would take away from our sense of cultural preservation. It would take away from our heritage. It would take away from our sense of self, right? And we know that there are dangerous ways that nostalgia can be used, because it can be used to kind of challenge other people's rights. But there's a lot of good to think about in terms of nostalgia. So I do think that it has a negative connotation. Sometimes we think about it as, oh, you're just stuck in the past. Like, why can't you like new music or something? And new rock en español, right? Or why aren't you into only what's popular today? But I think for looking at rock en español and keeping it in mind as something that we still love from our generation, and the new generations are liking it and loving it, I think we can think about nostalgia in a much broader way, which is that it's a way to build community, and it's a way to enhance thinking about these questions of what does it mean to be part of a Latino community, or a Latin American community, or the Latinx broader world, right? And so it's continuing to create new and exciting questions.
I guess you're talking about me in this sense. And I'll contribute to that. Nostalgia for me, it can be productive. It can be as a place where we launch onto new new ideas based on the past, right? And also to connect us to the past, to connect us to the people that we met in our past. But for me, it's also important to not just I mean, there's this in history we talk about declinism, which is to think that every past era was better than our era. And that's why I push back against that kind of nostalgia that can be sterile, that can not that for us is just, oh, we're thinking that everything in the past was better, and now there's whatever new music, whatever new cultural expressions are happening, it's not as cool as it was. And for me, I think it's good to think of obviously the past. I'm a historian. As a point of inspiration, but also as a point of departure. And if that informs, what we can create in the present, and that's where I do see nostalgia as being useful. I think that for me, in terms of rock en español, this is cover bands might just be kind of just reiterating that nostalgia. But if from that, new moments are created, new music is created, I'm all for it. And I feel that in the next phase of our podcast series, where we'll be talking about the legacies of rock en español with people in this generation that have encountered rock en español now from an intergenerational perspective through their parents, through their tios, tias, and also how they make their own memories based on that, those songs, new meanings to those songs. I feel that that's where I find that nostalgia is productive. And it not only productive in the capital sense, but that is able to generate, it's able to generate something new and also to tell something about the now.
Yeah, like emotionally productive, right?
Yes.
No, I think you point out some of the problems of nostalgia, and it is a little bit scary, right? Because I think as we get older, we think about, am I just living in the past? And I know this is a very specific to music example, but this is something that I like to do, is I like to listen to rock en español, for example, music of my younger era, but I also like to make sure to listen to what's in the contemporary zeitgeist, right? I want to know what music is happening today. I want to know reggaeton, and I want to know what's popular in contemporary, like rock en español, let's call it. So I think that's my way of kind of balancing those, right? Because those are real issues that we don't want to spend our time thinking, was the past always better, right? And I don't want to ever say that. Like, I don't think that that this era of the 1990s and the 2000s was better than it is today. But I can imagine that those are moments that should be celebrated. And that's one of the things that we're thinking about, is the celebration of countries coming out of dictatorships, right? And the potential that they have. And we as historians want to think about how we can celebrate eras without assuming that they're always better, but looking at the good that came out of those periods and what we can learn today. So, one of the things I've always wondered, since you grew up in Mexico and you probably definitely experienced rock en español before I did, what is kind of the first bands that you remember, or your most favorite earliest band, and why did you get into it? Since I mentioned when I uh, came on rock en español, and I first encountered Café Tacuba, for example. What was yours?
Wow, that's a really good question. The first song and the first band I listened to that was rock en español that um, really grabbed me was Enanitos Verdes. Enanitos Verdes, La Muralla, and I just really, really liked them, and I didn't know where they were coming from. I just knew that the beat was very rock, very quote unquote modern, and that it was in Spanish, and so this is the era before we could search everything on a search engine. So it was like, who's this? Me going to different record stores and then finding that there was this thing called rock en español. In terms of the Mexican rock, the rock mexicano, I do remember being in La Secundaria in middle school, and a friend going to a friend's house and said, "Look, I have this record, but we can only play it with headphones because it says bad words, and it says this yes, and it says this messages that the government doesn't want us to hear."
Oh.
I'm sure it wasn't as but it wasn't as dangerous as he made it seem.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was El Tri, and El Tri, like doing some albures and very, being very homophobic, I gotta say. But and he would do this kind of like albures in the their live performances that then they would record and that they would make it into a record. And I remember just sitting with like headphones, like huge, cans with the wire and the whole thing, and just listening to that. And it just, for me, it was like, oh my God, I'm doing something, forbidden, as the kids are saying now, los pasos prohibidos. It was like the discos prohibidos. And so, but I had no context of, why was it that it was censored? It was, I just knew that I wasn't supposed to be listening to that in public or, loud. And so those are the two songs that, like I first learned. But then both of them have larger historical context, as I very soon later came to find out. So, for example, Enanitos Verdes, they have a cover by El Extraño del Pelo Largo, which is like one of the first rock en español, or rock argentino rather, songs from the 60s. And it's talking about like a long haired guy, and at a moment that was countercultural. Mm-hmm. And then with El Tri, even though they came from middle class backgrounds, like they gravitated towards this working class a scene that was underground, and that was heavily police and in the quote unquote shanty towns of Mexico City in the periphery. And was persecuted, like not necessarily El Tri, but the fans were always seen as the gang members. They were always seen as the criminals in the 80s with all the different Panchitos gangs. And so being a punk in the Mexican City working class neighborhoods was being seen as a criminal, as a gang member. So those are, later on, I understood why rock en español was defined in its own ways.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. I don't know if I've ever asked you that before, how you got started on rock en español. I will say one thing, I don't know if I got into it enough, but for me, I think the first thing that I heard was Café Tacuba's Re, and then Shakira, of course, but I don't know, that's how we decided if we're calling her first and second albums like rock en español, I don't know. But I think Café Tacuba's Re was really, I think in a way that I got so excited about the genre was because it reminded me of a mixture of like I said, Mexican regional music and also folkloric music, like music that I grew up doing, dancing to in Ballet Folklorico, and then having these like statements about, I think, politics, but also about their city life, like of what it was like to be in Mexico City. And my family lives in Mexico City, and so I had visited, and I think that was very I think it was powerful, right? To think about that connection between us and them, and to be able to see it in music. And then when I learned that, there was kind of a gateway to more, say, Café Tacuba songs that they were doing covers of other Latin American music that I didn't know. That was also really exciting, because then it opened up a bunch of different genres, because they were doing, I think with Red and their next album, like they're looking at a lot of older genres and, I don't know, modernizing them, let's say, for lack of a better term here, in a way that made me want to go looking back and learn more and get into other styles and earlier periods, and even like the people who were really big in their native countries and maybe I didn't know about. And so I thought that was such a great gateway, to thinking about music.
Yes, you're referencing Avalancha de Éxitos that comes out in 1997.
Right.
And so this is what I find really fascinating about the genre, that, this is nostalgia, but in a productive way, right? Because they were covering songs from the 70s, 80s, either from really known artists like Leodan, or 90s Juan Luis Guerra from República Dominicana. And also some like very underground bands that they grew up with, like also the 90s. So this is like what I find really interesting, that it's not just music for the music's sake, but it teaches us new things. If at first it just teaches us about other bands, other artists, or other cultural currents. Now I want to ask you about the preparing and the writing of these episodes that you have done, which deal with in different facets of the rock nacional argentino. What is something new or actually surprising that you have learned or even remember as you have been preparing for these episodes?
Oh man, there's a couple things. So one, I mean, thinking, and this reminded me when you told me right now, that like kind of this sense of listening to it in a world in which you're not supposed to be, or it's wildly against the government. I think it's such an important contrast to think about in terms of how I listened to rock en español, was never with that sense of fear or concern that I was challenging the government in any way. And I think that was a really important reminder in the music, thinking about what it was really like for people to be afraid, right? And then to think about how, I think I was really struck in the research in terms of how much there was this idea, as you mentioned, of like people who had long hair were gang members or were part of, were a problem for society, right? That these rockeros were a problem. And it reminded me of my older family members who grew up in the 1960s and who would talk about that in terms of how they were treated as hippies, right? But to see that connection, and then to read about how the American hippies were seen as impacting and creating rockeros in Latin America, and that they were the fault. And so that when the American hippies went to Mexico to, drop acid or something, whatever to travel there, that they were bringing this bad American culture. And I think really too, thinking about how the long hair was talked about as this really problematic gender issue, that they were bringing like homosexuality. And I think I had never really considered why the long hair was such an issue, why it was on the table as this problematic thing. To me, it was just kind of like hippies have long hair, right? And I never thought about those big questions in I guess we're looking at the 60s to the 1990s, really, because from the period of the hippies in the U.S. to the hippies and the kind of rockeros in Latin America. So I think that gendered issue, and now that we're talking about that so much in our contemporary society, to think about how this has been an ongoing discussion, right, was really important. I think hard hitting. Mm-hmm.
I would add about the gender. Yes, I mean the rockeros were seen as a threat to the status quo, to societal status quo, but also they were breaking the gender binary, and by having long hair, by dressing androgynously. And that continues in Los Angeles, in 1990s Los Angeles. A lot of the bands dress with skirts or quills, paint their nails. And they were not necessarily super hip to queer theory necessarily. But there was that push against straight heteronormative norms. And I think that and I think that that's something that
and it reminds you that how much, I think when you point out that they didn't know about queer theory, but it reminds you how that stuff can happen on the ground, and maybe people don't necessarily know that they're doing it with other people together, but that it actually is where many of this kind of cultural changes happen. Those shifts happen with everyday people.
And not to make it as a very idyllic, super, gender and queer inclusive and super welcoming. There was definitely still homophobia in the scene, but there was a possibility of inclusion, and also just the of pushing against those very strict gender norms, and that that's something surprising to me when I started thinking about it. When I started researching these lyrics, for example, with Los Olvidados, a band that I know, that I, full disclosure, I work with. Jose Vergara is part of our podcast as the director of Music Wheel and the Miramonte a music program. But they do have a phrase, which is, en la sunset me atasco un joto. And for the longest time, my brain wanted to think that it was Me Atasco un Hot Dog as the song. And I had to go to the composer, Jorge Infante, and ask him, is it a hot dog or joto? He's like, no, it's a joto, like a gay dude. Because I was talking about this friend that he would, he was an immigrant and he would explore his queer desires on weekends. And for him, it was like, okay, if I don't hook up with a girl, I'll hook up with a guy. And for me, it was just shocking. But also, it talks about this, the immigrant experience as also being a moment of exploration. And so there's a lot of that that I think we can think of in terms of how these lyrics and the music, or just this aesthetics, this style, pushes against gender norms, be it politically, like with explicit messages, be it also gender, class. So there are many different aspects of it.
Yeah, and I saw a lot of the pushback from the conservative world of Latin America, and how they were constantly talking about how this long hair was such a sign that the patriarchal family was being challenged in Mexico and in Latin America, and that this was a real problem, and it was all the U.S.'s fault, right? So I thought that was fascinating. But yeah, great point.
And also women wearing pants, which is, very everyday, but, short hair. Like, that was like, oh, why is it that these women that go to these shows have short hair, right? There are things that are so basic now, like, so, but at the time, this is the place where you would be welcome and you would be celebrated for doing that, which was not everywhere else.
So we have some listener questions that we've actually gotten, and feel free to also send us questions on our Instagram. So what are the questions that we have? What does the future of Rock en Español look like, is our first question.
We're actually going to be tackling this with the youth, with some Gen Z students that I have met and that are really big Rock en Español fans in the present. So in the next episodes, we'll be hearing a bit of, what does Rock en Español look like? I would say that I get this question plenty, which is like, what happened to Rock en Español? Why did it die? I don't think it died. It's just, we changed the names. It became niche in terms of like, it broke into different genres, or we now understand it as a confluence of different genres. Perhaps, also Rock en Español does not really, as a term, does not encapsulate the diversity of this genre. And so the future continues to be quite interesting, I would say, because even reggaeton and some reggaeton songs are informed by Rock en Español, or the desire to sing about your life, your truth, or your desires in Español, which before everybody felt like they had to sing in English to do the crossover. And yes, we can think of Bad Bunny, that he, for the most part, has done it in Español.
And I think that's a good point, Jorge, because the whole point of Rock en Español was that explicit use of Spanish. It wasn't just like accidentally using Spanish here and there, but the explicit use of Spanish in a way to make a point to challenge the kind of English hegemony, or like the fact that everything has to be in English. So yeah, I think you're very right that we can think about the impact in a number of ways, right? Through contemporary reggaeton or to even contemporary, like the broad swath of all different kinds of, let's say, rock music. I guess we want to call it that, right?
And also the culture, the Latin American cultural richness that we see being expressed, mapped out in different songs and throughout different music genres in Latin America and beyond. So that's what I feel that the rock and, like we might not think of rock en español in those ways, but it continues to inform. So that's my answer to that question.
Yeah. You know what I also want to say too? I think that the fact that the use of Spanish has become so normalized with like reggaeton that to have the term rock en español might almost be redundant, right? It's like saying rock
And I
in
think
English,
that
right?
and I think
Which
that
is
that's
great,
the
in a
success
way.
of this. Like, we don't have to call it in Espanol. It's already implied that if it comes from Latin America or from U.S. Latinx communities, it can be en Español. And whichever way of Espanol is, Spanglish, that's, like having that cultural connection and that cultural inspiration or influence. I think that was what makes it rock en Español.
I agree. And I love that it kind of leads us into the last question or into the next question, which is that what's the legacy of rock en español in LA in particular?
I think that this is also a very interesting question. Thank you for sending it, listeners like you. What's a legacy? Well, we're recording this in summer 2023. Café Tacuba has had 2 sold-out shows at the Hollywood Bowl. Natalia Lafourcade is coming. Little Jesus played in Highland Park. División Minúscula played at the Roxy. Auténticos Decadentes and Cadillacs are also playing the Bowl. And it's like just like an everyday thing, like a normal thing. Concert season, you'll see these bands from Latin America playing at the major venues throughout Hollywood and throughout Southern California. That's one legacy, one that we're firmly part of the music landscape of Southern California, and also all these other festivals, the Bésame Mucho festivals before La Tocada, Reventón. And those are the legacies. I mean, like, that's the music that people come to hear, be it in a festival setting or also places like Club Nocturno or all these other Club Rock en Español nightclubs. I mean, that's the legacy, right? And now that it's an intergenerational legacy where parents who grew up with this music share with the music with their children. And I think one is just kind of the love for the music, and then also the fact that it's in Spanish connects to their culture. But I think that, and if there's something that we are trying to share with in our podcast, is how what other meanings can we draw from this music? It brought from the political moment of the 70s, 80s, 90s in Latin America, but also how does this music allows people, instead of just kind of like going to the shadows, but to be explicit about their and their existence in the U.S. as U.S. Latinx, but also a demand advocate for their rights at a time which is the 2023, but it could have been the 90s or the 80s, where their rights are constantly under attack and their livelihoods. So that's where I think that those are the legacies that Rock en Español continues to have in LA. And if we think of LA as Latin America, in Latin America as well.
Yeah, I agree. That's wonderful. So, Jorge, you recently were interviewed for a number of articles here in Southern California, and I was curious if there's anything that you weren't able to add to your articles, because, you have to cut everything down for size for newspapers.
You can only say so much. Both me in the piece in the Delos at the Los Angeles Times, which I'm very glad and thankful that they asked me to contribute, and also the Daily News interview. I think one thing is just to reiterate my thanks and my appreciation, admiration to folks that had collaborated, like in yourself, one of the main collaborators of our podcast series, you, Dr. Citlali, Sosa-Riddell, that have created 3 episodes, really interesting episodes about el rock nacional argentino. And you have really delved as a main collaborator in this history and the context. And also, I want to acknowledge our other contributors, such as Jose Vergara from the Miramonte Music Program, and his amazing students that have been recording these new versions of Rock en Español classics, Jose Anguiano from Cal State LA, and also the upcoming, you'll hear them, students from UCR, and also peer students such as Emilia Parodi. Another thing that I think I didn't quite get to in the articles, and that we have been thinking plenty, is who is the audience, right? Like, so, and why is it that we're recording, creating a Rock en Español podcast in English, right? And we just want to be explicit on the fact that we think of this podcast as an entry point, as a primer for second, third, later generations who have grown up in the U.S., listen to this music in Español, but whose first language is English, or a combination English and Spanish. And this allows, hopefully, them to have a greater context in their conversational language, which is English.
Shout out to the Spanglish crowd and to the No Sabo kids, because we're all here.
There you go.
And I want to thank everybody for coming and for listening. And I'm Professor Citlali Sosa-Riddell, and we hope to engage with you more. Check us out on Instagram.
Thank you, Professor Sosa-Riddell, for taking the time to ask some of these questions and also ask some very interesting questions in this episode. Well, this has been the discursive power of Rock en Español and the desire for democracy, o el rock en español y el anhelo democrático. We'll be back with new episodes to discuss the intergenerational legacies and the meanings of some of these key Rock en Español songs for US Latinx. Also, we'll get to hear some new versions of these songs performed by the students of the Miramonte music program. So make sure to share this podcast feed with your friends, your tias, tios, cousins, and tune in. New episodes on Wednesdays this summer 2023. This podcast is supported by the University of California Humanities Research Institute. We're very thankful for their support. Also, we're very thankful for you listening in. Hasta pronto.